just for this one, or just in case. So mobile web anatomy. So these are all kind of things that we do need to consider, obviously, when we are not only working in mobile, but also from a sense of any digital platform. So choosing the right typeface. We, of course, just tapping into typography in general, we still always need to consider our design goal and our target, the overall design style and mood. Of course, current trends, this is maybe a little less nowadays. While we do need to consider trends that are out there, we also don't want to be too trendy. So it can be a fine line between ensuring that we are up with the times, but not being too wild and crazy. Again, depending on the target. If your target is a younger audience and, a clothing store, something like that, then obviously you might be able to get away with something that's a little bit more trendy. But we always need to consider readability and legibility, of course. You might have noticed that in Figma, especially depending on what type organization and not organization, what's the word I'm looking for? Like font book on your computers. I use a different one. It's called Suitcase. I've just always used it. I don't know. I just can't get away from using it. It's been 15 probably plus years of using it. Saying that if I go and I purchase a font or download a font, if it's not in or active in font book, it won't come up in Figma. There were some typefaces that with the update, there are a few more typefaces that Figma has included on there. So while it's nice to be able to go and install a font and maybe do something a little more interesting, there's a reason why not all fonts are accessible from Figma, because of the accessibility standpoint and because of that novelty typeface standpoint. So we want to make sure that everything is readable and they are web safe fonts. Does everybody understand what a web safe font is? Typeface? Maybe not. Shannon's nodding. If your typeface is not recognizable online, you are running the risk that it's going to come up. You know, when you open up an InDesign document or an Illustrator document, you don't have that typeface and it shows up weird. It defaults to like Myriad or something like that. That's what can happen. So if you've gone and used a weird old typeface and it looks really cool on your side, if it's like from, say, Dafont or something like that, it might not show up properly. Not only from it's not showing up properly, but also, again, because of Google and because of the legalities from the WCAG guidelines, they're there for a reason for accessibility. So all these considering from a beautiful visual point of view, we also need to very much understand or focus on the accessible point of view. So making sure that they are readable for your mass audience. So we have sans serif and obviously serif typefaces. Pardon me, the size. The size can matter. Size does matter. It's an important factor that we do need to consider. But what everybody will always say is, well, what's the right size? I'm sure you've all experienced 10 point in one typeface is going to be very different in a 10 point in another typeface. 16 point for mobile is considered to be the best for eyes, or 12 pixels. I would say that's a bit large. I personally, whether it's on a mobile or a desktop, do not go below a 14 point. Again, that's speaking on behalf of most web-safe fonts and most readily used web-safe fonts. So typefaces like Montserrat, Isadora, Roboto, Open Sans, PT Serif, I believe is another one, Times. They're generally around the same X height. If you folks remember X height from typography, they're mostly in around that same size. So you're safe around that 13, 14 point. I say do not go below 13. 13 can be pushing it depending on the instance you're using it in. So sticking within those guidelines, and then obviously looking at your design principles when it comes to finding your contrasting size in hierarchy. So when we talk about the size contrast, this is not quite enough, right? There's not really enough hierarchy between what that title font is and what that may be. So we call that your H1. Your H2 would be your subheading or your subheading type size. Do you guys know H1, H2? Probably from your visual web courses. And then your body. So making sure there is enough and there's a nice cohesiveness between the sizes, because if we do too much, if the sizing again is maybe a little bit too much contrast, it also looks a little bit wonky. So making sure that we stick within those guidelines. And a lot of it's just going to be practice. A lot of it's maybe showing a peer or showing your teacher. They'll be able to tell you, you're like, oh, these seem a little bit extreme. Sometimes it means playing with that.
Can't the extreme be like a level of like editorial though, like something that is like done on purpose that makes a statement? I mean, I guess that's when you know the rules first, and then that's when you can break
that's
them.
right. Yeah, that's right. Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
Where I so
because I just did a document for production class, and I have like my inside my table, like very like it was 7.5 because I had to fit in all the information, but then I did like super big on the side, and it looked so cool. But anyways, we'll see what Angela says.
There's also a difference between what is being done for like a visual element versus what's there as direct copy for readability. So in one instance, like, so say if we're laying out a magazine layout, for example, we would have like a big giant heading, but then within the body, it's really small. So there's a huge contrast between them. But saying that, that's almost set as a graphic element, and set as not really set as like your heading size. Your heading size would then be within your body copy, and then you would have a little bit like not as much contrast between those two. Also, for example, say if that's in a magazine layout, but also thinking from a sense of in a website. So if we look at, we call those our heroes, so that header image, wherever we have that, if we have our copy in there and it's really big, it doesn't mean if that's our H1, it doesn't mean that that's going to be used within our actual body copy on the website. That's just going to be within those headers. And then the rest of it will have a little bit more of a proper hierarchy, proper contrast between them. So then we would set, so that might be our H1. Our H1 might be giant because we're using that as a visual element, but then our H2 and then maybe an H3 and then our body copy will have a little bit more cohesiveness between type size. That makes sense to you? Cool. Again, so here, pardon me, hierarchy, a typographic scale. Once we start to lay things out, again, I feel that this is something you get to know a little bit. So as you start to learn and get into the design of stuff, you will, as your site progresses, so I'm talking more so from a sense of like wireframes and roughs. Once you start to get a little bit more refined, you start to decide, okay, before you get too far, you decide what your H1 is, what your H2 is. I'm saying that in complete honest and transparency from a sense of when I first started, I would just get going and then I would start, okay, well, now there's some inconsistencies here. And I would start to build that as I went along versus now I kind of decide at the beginning. And yes, there is some wiggle room, but now at the beginning, I decide before I get too far into the design. I'm like, okay, I know that my headline is going to be 16, 17 point. My H1, my H2 is going to be, say, 15 point. My body is going to be 14 point. My body's going to be 14 point. That's an interesting statement. So That's something I do now. And same thing, you know, like when you get to into your buttons, it's like I know I want my buttons to be all caps, semi bold, 14 point. That takes time. You folks will start to do that. It's going to probably mean designing a few frames and a few pages to really decide, okay, because as you get going, you're going to go back and forth and be like, okay, actually, you know what, that looks too big. Worked here, but it maybe didn't work here. And I still do that to this day. But making sure we don't have too many of those. So again, we're talking about our H1, H2, H3s, maybe pushing it, depends on how big the site is or the app is. You might have a body text 1 or 2, not super often, but then you also might have your a different type size for your navigation and your buttons. Speaking of navigation. So navigation styles, for mobile in particular, there's 2 common ways that we could build that. More so from a sense of an app, we will have it as a sticky footer, which is that footer that sits on the bottom of our site and doesn't move. So think about all the apps that you are interacting with. That footer stays there. It doesn't move, it doesn't jump around. Then we also have the hamburger style menu, and that's up at the top. And that's where those hamburger, we call it with those 3 lines. That is generally in the top left or the top right. And those can open a few different ways, which we talk about in this lecture. And it just really depends. There are some mobile responsive websites. So if you're just online, it's not particularly an app that will open up with a footer at the bottom. It is fairly rare. Most of the time when your site is responsive, it's just going to respond with a hamburger style menu. Just as a little side note, when it comes to desktop, I noticed some people like to try that hamburger style menu when it comes to a desktop. I think it's interesting, but I do want to note it's not super intuitive. So unless you really need it from a sense of your navigation is huge and you're going to need one along the top with some additional navigation, you might want to integrate that in as like a, here's some extras. But for the most part, I would avoid that. What other way we can do our navigation on our mobile, if we want to do something that's more so along the top, is something that we can do as a slider, so a left or right. So you can essentially have like a normal navigation that you would in desktop, and then that's where you would swipe to see the rest of it. Again, not super common. You'll more so see that type of navigation if I'm trying to think of an example, like a clothing site. So you go to their hamburger menu and I go to, you know, women's clothing. I just go directly to the women's clothing site. Maybe when I land there, there's going to be a little slider that allows me to look up the denim, the pajamas, the tops, the t-shirts, and that's where you might get that side scroll. So there's lots of different options that, again, it's up to you folks to try. And it might just mean you interacting with different sites and seeing what you think is most intuitive or what you think works the best. So that footer navigation, some will argue the footer navigation is the best for mobile apps because it's what they call that thumb-driven design, because we use that thumb to scroll. Again, that could be utilized as with an iconography style sticky footer. Or you could put that hamburger style menu at the base. Again, not super intuitive. So it's really cool to be interesting. But if we're completely changing the wheel from what everybody is used to, not super ideal. Sorry, if you folks give me just one second. I'm trying to remember.
Anyone tried to do that?
Because I teach you because I teach not quite the same content, but I teach UX the other one. I'm like trying to remember if I spoke to you guys about that or not. Some people will do that. So some people will add something interesting to represent their navigation. It's kind of fun, but again, not super intuitive.
Not intuitive, yeah.
Yeah. So funny if it's a hamburger, you know, I'd leave that up to like Harvey's to maybe, or like
I
McDonald's to give a go.
yeah,